I have added a few resources to our week 2 page in Blackboard down at the bottom here. The essay scoring guide and its explanation give us an idea of what I'm looking for when I grade these essays. So make sure you take a look at that and let me know if you have any questions about it. It's important that you know what I'm expecting of you, otherwise you are kind of writing in the dark, not knowing what a particular instructor likes or doesn't like. The scoring guide is there not only for me to make grading easier, but it's also to make grading more transparent, and it helps you in that way, because whatever marks I put on your essay or whatever grade I give you, I have to justify in the terms of this rubric. I can't just decide I don't like your essay for some random reason and give you a poor grade. So you have recourse through that rubric. It lets you know what I am looking for. The very bottom resource here is a document that is 2 paragraphs taken from my own writing, an essay I wrote in grad school many moons ago. And it's a literary analysis over the Edgar Allan Poe short story, The Cask of Amontillado, which you may have read in high school or for something else. So let's take a look at that. I wanted to give you a play-by-play example of what I think a decent literary analysis is. I'm not saying this is like the best literary analysis ever. There's plenty of issues with it. But because it's my own writing, I can kind of take you through the process since I actually put it together. And it's a decent enough example of it. I presented this paper at some regional conferences for some academic conferences when I was in graduate school. So the basic format of a paragraph is you want the beginning to be your claim slash transition sentence, right? So in the bright yellow there, we have our claim slash transition sentence. And the point of this paper was, if you're familiar with the story, the narrator kills Fortunato, the other character. He lures him down into the catacombs and walls him up in the crypt, buries him alive, essentially. Typical Poe. And my thesis for this was that the reason he does that is because the 2 men are lovers, and the narrator feels betrayed by the man he's killing. So to do that, I have to prove, first of all, that the narrator is sane. Most critics who look at the story conclude that the narrator is crazy, he's insane. So when I looked at the arguable thesis scale, defensible to arguable, I played around with a few different ideas, and I found in my research that most people who have researched the story and written about the story find the narrator to be crazy. And therefore, the idea that the narrator is not crazy, that he actually is sane and has a reason for performing his actions, was in the minority. It's more arguable. More people will argue with it. I found less evidence to support it. It was an uphill battle, and that was the thesis I went with for those reasons. And then I flipped it. What if the narrator's insane? Well, I found a bunch of evidence for that. Fewer people were going to argue with it. So that was much more defensible, not as worth my time in terms of writing about it. And my thesis ended up actually being, once I figured out that I wanted to write about how he was sane, I took it a step further and said, okay, well, if he's sane, why is he doing this? The main point of the story, the conflict of the story, is that he kills this guy. So what's the reason? And I started kind of looking around in the story itself, and I came up with this idea that maybe one reason that we see murder in the real world is because one lover is murdering another, or a husband is murdering a wife. You ever watch Dateline? Husbands murder wives all the time. So I thought, why don't we go with that? And I was able to find enough evidence so that I thought it was a defensible idea, and it was definitely an arguable idea. So the topic sentence here, I have my transition further, my transition word, and I'm talking about how the 2 men are lovers, and then I'm specifically looking at one symbol in the story, which is the family crest described in the story, and the narrator, Montresor, is really big into family. He talks a lot about how his family is important, and his family honor really matters to him, and of course he commits the murder in his family crypt, so this is all very important to him, and the family crest is symbolic. And the kind of ugly blue-gray highlighting here that I've got in these 2 spots, those are primary source quotes. And you can see just at a glance, the paragraph is about a page long. And it's so long because this is Courier font, and it's double-spaced, and it's size 12. And that just makes the font really, really big in terms of how much page space it takes. This was a requirement of the class I was in at the time. So you don't have to use that font, and in fact, if we use a smaller font, the paragraph would look a much more reasonable size. So be advised that your paragraphs don't have to be a page long. That's a really long paragraph. Normally, I would say make your paragraphs a little shorter than that. But in this case, you can see structurally we've got the claim sentence at the top, and then about equally spaced, we've got primary source quote, and all the rest is essentially analysis. So right after the claim sentence, I bring in my primary source quote, and notice, as I mentioned in the literary analysis video about integrating quotes, that I put it in the same sentence. I have the colon right here. I introduce the idea, colon, and then I go into the quote. I don't just drop it into its own separate sentence with no introduction. I cite it properly, meaning I have quotation marks at the beginning and end. I have a space, my parenthetical citation, and then my closing punctuation outside the parentheses. This is how MLA wants it, right? The reason this doesn't say PO 329 is because I specifically say that I'm referencing the story up here. Otherwise, I would put Poe, blah, blah, blah. I do the same thing down here, which is why it's just the number. Also, in the essay, I include Poe's name in parenthetical citations earlier a few times in the essay, and once you've cited a source as your primary source several times, then later on in the essay, when referring to it, you can just use page numbers. So that's what I'm doing here. Normally, you would include the author name, so it'd be Poe space 369 within the parentheses. So I have my source quote here, my primary source, and then I analyze it, boom, boom, boom. And then I move on to a different aspect of my claim. Both of these refer to the claim at hand, the family crest. So the whole paragraph covers what I'm announcing in the claim sentence. It's the point of the claim sentence and the point of the paragraph that it will be cohesive, that it will cover the same topic. And this shorter source quote here, I then expand with paraphrasing. That's what this kind of peach colored, if you can see it, highlighter is. I paraphrase part of it, which means I'm just putting material from the primary source in my own words. And because I've cited the direct quote here, and then I go directly into the paraphrase, I don't have to have another parenthetical citation here. Note that if I just paraphrased, if I didn't have a direct quote, I would still need to put a parenthetical citation, whether you're directly quoting, as I do in the gray-blue highlighter, or whether you're paraphrasing, as I do in the peach highlighter, you need to have a parenthetical citation. That's how you avoid plagiarism, right? And then after that, I move on and I analyze more. So it's claim sentence, quote, analyze, quote, analyze. That's your basic template for any paragraph in a literary analysis. The second example, which is a much longer paragraph, and again, this was a paper that was like 20 pages long initially, and the paragraph, because of the big font and the depth I was analyzing, the paragraphs are really long. And that's also something I do personally. My style is just really long-winded, in case you can't tell from my rambling videos. So you don't have to have paragraphs that are anywhere near that long, so don't worry about that. But this second paragraph, we can see here is the claim sentence. We'll do bright yellow here. I say, and no, these two sentences, or these two paragraphs rather, are not contiguous. They were pulled from totally separate parts of the essay, so don't worry about that. But the paragraph begins here with announcement of the claim, and then I use this transition phrase in more ways than these. So you can tell I've just finished listing some ways in which the silence of the narrator, a particular aspect of the story, proves my thesis, and now I'm moving on to a different way that my thesis is supported. So I've got this claim sentence that announces what the paragraph's going to be about and has that little transition phrase to help move us along. And then immediately I introduce a quote, my secondary source from a writer, a critic named Dan Shen. So I say, this person talking about this other Poe story says, boom. And then I've got the purple here is a secondary source quote, right? Kind of a longer quote, direct source quote. And again, the reason I don't have Shen 329 here is because I have announced the name of the author of this quote earlier in the sentence, right? If I didn't say that, if I just said, one critic says, blah, 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 then I would need to have his last name there, right? And then I analyze, boom, boom, boom. You can tell I'm analyzing the Dan Shen quote because I name drop him a couple times here. And then later on, as part of my analysis, I have another blue-gray. This is a primary source quote from the story itself, right? And again, I'm integrating it into my own sentence with that colon. This is kind of a much longer quote. This is actually two. I stop here and then I say, and another example, and then boom. Normally I wouldn't have so much quote altogether. Again, even if this was a smaller font, this would be like a 4 or 5 lines of two quotes kind of mashed together. Normally I would say I would stop and I'd analyze this first quote before I moved on to this second one, but I'm kind of analyzing both later on. So I have, again, look at the format. Claim sentence, I introduce a quote, I analyze that quote, and then I introduce another couple quotes. I do a little paraphrasing here. That's why this is the peachy colored. And then I analyze for the rest of the paragraph these other quotes. So it's the same format as this one. It's a little bit longer and more in depth, but you can see structurally it works. Claim sentence, quote, analysis, quote, analysis. That should be your goal for every paragraph. And you can even do that sentence by sentence. The claim sentence obviously is one sentence. A quote can be a sentence, remember, integrated into your own words. So that sentence would be part your own words and then part the quote. Sentence of analysis, quote, sentence of analysis. Ideally, you want those analysis sections to be the bulk of your paragraph. As you can see here, notice the unhighlighted, which is analysis, is the majority of the paragraph. So you want at least 2 sentences of analysis for every quote you have. But as a structure, this is a pretty solid goal for a literary analysis. It keeps your paragraphs on track with a claim, and it keeps your essay on track by staying focused on quotes from the primary source, which is the story itself you're writing about, or your secondary sources, which of course are the research that you're gathering. A good rule of thumb is to have one primary source quote and one secondary source quote in each paragraph. I did not do that in this one. I had 2 primaries, but you can see in the second, much longer paragraph, I have a secondary source quote and then later a primary source quote, and then I go back and I'm paraphrasing my secondary source quote from Dan Shen here later on. So as a rule of thumb, you want to try to balance it between primary and secondary. But of course, the bulk of it should be your own ideas. Remember, this is my own analysis here. The big sections of white are all my own analysis. So you can see that that's my focus, even though that focus is guided by my claim sentence and the quotes. I hope this helps. As always, email me or text me if you have any questions.